It appears I'm getting quite a reputation around here. Someone came up to my desk today. Someone I'd never seen before, with a very strange story. You're the guy who's writing the book about the hospital, right? The one they talk about. I'd been working on a list for the previous day's on-call personnel, trying to get it ready for whoever was going to be working tomorrow, and I looked up to find a woman in scrubs standing beside my desk. She looked terrified, her hands clutching the shoulders of her scrub top. She looked oddly put together to be trying to hold herself together, and I realized that something must have happened recently. This place is like a snake sometimes. It strikes without warning. I am. Did you have something you wanted to tell me? I said, offering her a chair. She sat, looking around as if she expected to be attacked by someone at any minute. I don't know. Carl and David told me that you were collecting stories, and David said it helped to talk about the weirdness sometimes. I'm just hoping for some perspective and maybe some advice. Nothing like this has ever happened to me before. I told her to have a seat for a few minutes while I finished up, and as I typed, she slowly drew her legs against her chest. Whatever she had seen had really affected her, and she kept jerking her head to look behind her like someone was going to creep up on her. She was terrified, clearly out of her element, and whatever it was, it spooked her. I hit send on the list a few minutes later, opening up a notepad as I prepared to dictate. Okay, tell me all about it. She nodded, peeking at me through her knees and looking very young for a woman that was probably older than I was. It happened so quickly, but it felt like it ran in slow motion. Do you know how sometimes things get fuzzier the farther it gets from when they happened? This isn't like that. I can remember it perfectly, like a photograph in my head. She put her forehead against her knees, and the chair creaked a little as she shivered. It started when I got to work. I've been a nurse for right around 10 years. I started on the 3rd floor, but I found that I liked helping out in the OR, so I transferred to the surgical department and have loved it ever since. I've had several doctors ask for me to help circulate their cases, and as such, I usually find myself with a lot of overtime at the end of the month. I was coming in for one such time, called in to help with an emergency procedure, when the trouble started. I got to work about 20 minutes after they called. It was the middle of the afternoon, so I was still awake and just kind of enjoying my weekend. I pulled on some scrubs and drove in, and when I got there, I noticed that no one was in the change-out room. That seemed odd. Surely they wouldn't have started without me. And as I opened my locker, I was in for another surprise. Someone had taken my coat. It was just a regular white scrub coat, the kind with lots of pockets and patches, but it also had my spare name tag on it. I looked around to see if maybe I'd sent it to laundry by mistake, but it was nowhere to be found. I wasn't terribly worried. I must have just forgotten that I took it home, and I scrubbed up and got ready for the case. I wondered why they had started without me, and reflected that it wasn't the only time the scrub team had acted weird lately. I was friends outside of work with more than one of them, but they had stopped inviting me to things as of late. I had thought maybe they were busy at first, but over time, I realized they were just going out without me. I asked them about it, wondering why they were acting so distant, and they told me it was me who was acting weird. They said they saw me in the hallways sometimes, and I would refuse to talk to them. They would see me in the halls or in the elevator, but I would pretend not to know them or ignore them altogether. I told them I had no clue what they were talking about, but I don't think they believed me. I realized I'd been wool gathering as I stood at the sink, and I finished scrubbing out so I could get to work. There was no one in the hall getting things together, and I wondered how big of an emergency this had been. They had said emergency, but it just sounded like a car accident. The patient was conscious and really just needed some foreign objects removed so the wounds could be closed. It wasn't a code blue situation, and I couldn't believe they would start without everyone being there. I walked down the hall to room 2, and that's when I saw them. They were all standing around the table, Dr. Carter moving about as the nurses handed him things or helped him with the removal of what appeared to be pieces of wooden fence. He was saying something to the woman on his left, and as she reached for the tray beside her, I realized they had started without me. I was offended before I did a head count and realized they had a full team in the room. There were 7 of them, all people I knew, and at the right hand of the doctor was a woman wearing a familiar white coat with a very familiar silver name badge. She turned when he said her name, nodding as she reached for something beside her, and that's when I realized that I knew her too. She was me. She looked like me, at least as much of her as I could see, and from the eyes to the hairline, she was a dead ringer. She moved a little stiffly, her turns looking mechanical, but other than that, she was me. She never looked my way. There was no sinister crinkling of eyes shared between us, or a creepy smile seen from the corners of her mask, but the longer I looked at her, the worse I began to feel. The feeling is hard to describe, but the closest I can approximate is a feeling of vertigo. I felt dizzy, my vision shaking a little as I looked at my double. There was a pressure in my eyes, something like a change in altitude, and I just knew that if I were to go and talk to her or touch her, something terrible would happen. She was me, just as I was me, and we were not supposed to occupy the same place at the same time. I didn't know what else to do, so I just left. I walked until I left the OR and came out into the lobby. That's when I saw you and realized you must be the one that David had talked about when he said you collected stories. So here I am, unsure of whether I need to go back and confront the other me or not. I finished typing, the woman looking at me as if expecting something. I didn't know what exactly to give her, but I knew who would. I called Carl and told him there was someone in the OR impersonating a nurse. He came pretty quickly then, and when he saw the woman sitting at my desk, he called her Carol and pulled up a chair to see what was wrong. Two had known each other for a while, it seemed, and when she told Carl about the missing jacket and the imposter in the OR, he told her to come with him so they could ID the perpetrator. "I'll make sure you're safe before I apprehend them, but I may need you to ID them so I can have something to tell the police." The two left, Carl and Carol thanking me for my help, but that wasn't quite the end of the story. I saw a few off-duty security guards coming in about 30 minutes later. No sooner had they wandered in than Carl had called me and told me to announce a lockdown. "Tell them the doors are closed until further notice. No one comes in or out unless cleared by security." He had a security team member at every exit, even a couple of blue and whites from the Cashmere Police Department, and they checked those coming in and going out as Carl had some of the other guys search the hospital. The lockdown wasn't lifted till after visiting hours were over, and that was when I got the rest of the story. Carl looked tired as he flopped into the seat beside me, the same one Carol had occupied earlier in the day. He looked tired, clearly doing a lot more legwork than he was used to, and I turned my YouTube video down as I asked if everything was okay. "Yeah, but Carol's pretty shaken up about it. We had someone take her home and check her house, but I don't think she'll be back to work for a little while." "So what actually happened?" I asked, opening the same documents so I could make some notes. Carl looked around like he was afraid someone might see him. It's pretty bizarre for this place," I said, eliciting a laugh from Carl. True. Okay, so after we left, Carl and Carol had gone down to the OR so Carl could ID the imposter. When they got there, the OR was in a bit of an uproar. Dr. Carter saw Carol and asked where she had gone and how she had left without anyone noticing. "We were worried about you. One minute you were there, and then the next minute you were gone." Carol said that she hadn't been here. That hadn't been her. That it was a stranger. But Dr. Carter had only shrugged. She looked just like you, down to the Disney masks you always wear and the scent of your deodorant. Carl asked if she'd sounded like Carol, but no one seemed to be able to remember if the woman had spoken or not. People had spoken to her. Some of them were sure that she had answered, but they couldn't remember a single interaction with her. She'd been passing instruments, had been passing more sutures at the time when Dr. Carter had turned and found she was gone. No one saw her leave, but she must have. People don't just disappear. Carl had called in backup, and they had locked the hospital down and searched it from top to bottom. He had one of his officers check the cameras too, but no one could find the woman leaving the OR area. It was like she had walked into the OR at 7:15 and never walked out again. It wasn't the strangest thing I had ever heard, but it was definitely up there. The weirdest part was where we found her coat. Weirder than a disappearing person? Well, we took Carol back to her locker before we locked down the facility to see if we could find any evidence of a break-in, but when she opened the locker, the coat was right there, like it had never left. Carol looked at it like she couldn't believe it, and when she kinda sat down, I sent her home. They searched her house for anyone who might have gotten in, but it was clean too. It's the damnedest thing. I believe that she saw what she saw, but to find that coat right there in the locker, I just don't know. He went back to it not long after, and I was left to ponder what it had all meant. The hospital has always been a strange place, but between jumping ghosts and tapping in the morgue and the strange stairwells, the weirdness has escalated beyond anything I've ever heard of. The activity is growing, and I wonder how long it will be before the everyday visitors to the hospital begin to take notice as well. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them, shall we? Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet and Lady Vengeance for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, come on down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you best. I always recommend the Ghostly Reader tier, since you get a signed book anytime I write one on your doorstep. But I have many tiers, and again, I'm sure you'll find one to suit you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.